There's so many details I find fascinating about life in the age of sail, and I think one of the best examples of life at sea is shown in the film Master and Commander. This video will be a scene-by-scene, frame-by-frame type approach, looking at the historical accuracy of the film and all the little details that I think are interesting, make it such a good representation of what life must have been like at sea in the 1800s. I'm going to take it pretty slow, there's a whole load of tangents, and I'm not going to touch on the plot. Got a lot to cover, so I'm just going to jump into it. I find it quite useful to have a bit of context in terms of what period of time things are happening in, so I'll lay out a quick timeline. I find that when you actually look at timelines, you realise how close some events are to one another and how far apart others are. The film is set in 1805, 2 years after the start of the Napoleonic Wars, and the same year as the Battle of Trafalgar and the death of Admiral Lord Nelson. In England, George III is king, so we're in the Georgian period. In America at this point, it's around the time the Louisiana Territory is created, after the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. This is where the US purchased land from the French First Republic, so the US will sort of look like this at this point. I think this time was known as the Young Republic period within the Revolution and New Nation era, but feel free to correct me on that. It's 10 years before the Battle of Waterloo, 42 years after the end of the 7 Years' War. In terms of pirate time, which I like to think of everything around, it's roughly 85 years after the end of the golden age of piracy, about 87 years after the death of Blackbeard. It's 71 years before the first steel ship will be launched. The film is based on the Aubrey Marturin book series, the first book in the series being Master and Commander. If you're a fan of the book, the dates don't line up with the film, but events in the film are based on events from other books in the series. The title, Master and Commander, is in reference to the rank of Master and Commander, a title given to Royal Navy officers in charge of ships of war that were considered too large to be commanded by a lieutenant, or lieutenant if you're American, but too small to merit being commanded by a post captain. The rank of post captain was itself used to distinguish between officers who were captains by rank and officers who were referred to as captain by virtue of being in command of a ship. Any officer in charge of a ship was addressed as captain, regardless of their rank, just to make it a bit more confusing. So, the rank structure would be that a commander was senior to a lieutenant, but junior to a captain. We might think of the ship's captain as being solely responsible for the sailing of a ship of war, but these things were very complicated. This is where the rank of master, or sailing master, comes in. This was a naval warrant officer, whose sole responsibility was the navigation of the ship. Essentially, this is a professional seafarer who specialised in navigation. In the film, this rank is held by Mr. Allen, a commissioned officer who ranks alongside but after the lieutenants. Having a sailing master meant that the ship's captain could delegate the sailing duties and focus on the overall management of the ship as a whole. This left the sailing master to focus on duties such as setting course, managing how much sail was out in accordance with weather conditions, and recording the ship's position. In short, the master would sail the ship, the captain would fight it. When it came to engagements at sea, the master would be stationed next to the captain. The captain would determine how the ship would engage the enemy, and the master would see to the practicalities of steering the ship as directed. However, the film is called Master and Commander, which is itself a rank. This was given when the captain was to be solely responsible for both the sailing and fighting of a ship, fulfilling the role of both master and commander. In 1794, that's 9 years before the film is set, the title was shortened to just Commander. However, many who'd been in the service for a long time were slow to drop the Master and from their title, and the rank remained in unofficial usage for many years. So, I think we can assume that for the film, even though there is both a Master and a Commander on board, Master and Commander refers to Jack Aubrey, who's the commander, but also the captain. The film opens on the HMS Surprise sailing the waters off the north coast of Brazil, with orders to intercept the French privateering ship the Acheron. The Acheron wasn't a real ship, but it very closely resembles the USS Constitution. Both the fictional Acheron and the USS Constitution are rated as 44-gun frigates. The Acheron has been sent to harass the British whaling fleet in the South Pacific. British whaling history can broadly be divided into 3 groups: Northern, Southern and Modern. The Acheron is likely hunting ships of the Southern Whale Fishery Fleet. Known as the South Seas Trade, British whalers fished the South Atlantic and South Pacific between 1775 and 1861. Whaling was a massive industry throughout the 1800s, with one of the highest value commodities being found in the southern seas, the sperm whale. The head of a sperm whale contains a liquid wax substance called spermaceti, which was 2 to 3 times more valuable than the oil found in other whales, making it both an amusingly named whale and a desirable catch. British whalers were often the target of foreign powers, particularly during wartime, so there is historical precedence for the Acheron hunting them. In 1797, several whalers were captured after the outbreak of the Anglo-Spanish War, when they called into port in Peru, not knowing that war had broken out between the two nations. In 1812, at the start of the Second American War of Independence, the USS Essex captured a number of British whalers in the Pacific. Merchant ships were not defenceless, though. Wartime could be quite profitable for British ships in distant waters, and whalers often also sailed with a letter of marque, so they could plunder any other merchantmen they came across. Essentially acting as state-sanctioned pirates, a letter of marque meant that in the eyes of the British law, the British ship was allowed to attack and plunder vessels of enemy states as they fancied. Unless the enemy states caught them, of course. They didn't take too kindly to that kind of thing. Interestingly, the USS Essex's capture of British whalers was inspiration for one of the books in the Aubrey Maturin series called The Far Side of the World, in which the fictional USS Norfolk is hunting whalers in the Pacific. So, the fictional Acheron is based on the fictional USS Norfolk, which is based on the real exploits of the USS Essex. As a side note, according to an interview given by the film's director, apparently the Acheron is made into a French privateer, not an American one, because the studio thought American audiences wouldn't know who to root for. The Americans, even though they were shown to be the antagonist, or the British, who were shown to be the heroes, but were attacking an American ship. Apparently it's alright to villainise the French, though. The opening shots are of the HMS Surprise, a 3-masted frigate with a crew of 197, armed with 28 cannons. The HMS Surprise was a real ship. However, what is shown in the film and the books is different to what happened in history. The Surprise started life as the Unite and was a French Navy corvette. When sailing as a courier ship between Toulon in the south of France and the port of Beaune in North Africa, she was attacked by the HMS Inconstant. The Unite's captain had been taken ill with smallpox, so command of the ship had fallen to the first lieutenant. Unfortunately, he had identified the HMS Inconstant as a neutral ship, so hadn't readied the crew for battle or cleared the ship for action. The Inconstant sailed alongside, boarded, and took the Unite from the French. After her capture, the Unite was renamed the HMS Surprise in 1796. The ship remained in the Royal Navy for the next 6 years until she was decommissioned and broken up in 1802. That's 3 years before the film is set. So, while at this point in time the Surprise was no longer afloat, it was part of the Royal Navy fleet, and it was around that time, give or take a few years. The film starts with a Surprise in the South Atlantic Ocean off the coast of Brazil. The first scene from inside the Surprise is of a lone sailor coming up from the ship's hold, and it'll probably make a bit more sense if I give a rough layout of the ship here. The Surprise is technically a Unite-class corvette. I'll try and give a quick overview without getting too bogged down in ship class types. As mentioned, the Surprise started out as a French ship and was the lead ship in that class. This means it was the first ship of its class ever built, so any ship built to the same design as the Unite would be a Unite class. The classification being named after the first ship built within the class. When the ship was taken over by the Royal Navy, it was designated as a 6th-rate frigate. Corvettes and frigates are very similar in terms of classification, and there was a bit of overlap between the two. The rating system in the Royal Navy was that a ship would be rated between 1 and 6. Typically, ships of the line would be rated 1 to 4. Great frigates are 5th, and frigates and post ships are 6th-rate ships. Anything lower than a 6th-rate ship was considered as unrated: sloops, brigs, schooners and such. French corvettes were equivalent to a Royal Navy post ship. Post ships were just a bit smaller than frigates. To make things confusing, a post ship would also have been called a frigate. Only the Admiralty would really make the distinction between a post ship and a frigate, and that's before we get into the fact that a post ship was considered as frigate built. To keep things simple, we'll consider the Surprise as a 6th-rate frigate. In general, frigates consisted of 3 masts, square-rigged sails, and had 1 continuous deck to house their main armament. Square-rigged means that the yards are perpendicular to the mast, so the sails are square on to the direction of travel. The main guns were housed on an upper deck. Carrying the guns in this manner gave frigates a height advantage over other ships, which could come in useful in bad weather conditions when an enemy ship might have to close their lower gun deck ports to avoid their boat being swamped. This could often even the odds in naval battles. If a ship with 3 gun decks can only use 2 of them because they can't open the gun ports on the lowest deck for fear of taking on too much water, the frigate becomes more evenly matched. That's also considering that the lowest deck would usually house the heaviest and most dangerous cannon. The deck layout on the HMS Surprise is, or was, the spar deck, which consists of the quarterdeck and forecastle. These were joined by gangways with an open portion in the middle, which allowed light and air into the deck below. The upper deck, which could be referred to as the main deck, or gun deck, this housed the heavier cannon, and the lower deck, which could be called the crew deck or berth deck, which housed the majority of the crew, and finally the hold and orlop decks, used to store provisions. I think this opening scene is great for getting an idea of the layout of the ship, as it shows a sailor walking from the hold all the way through the ship. So, starting with a sailor coming up from the ship's hold. I'm not too sure who this is. At first I thought it was the captain's steward, Preserved Killick, but now I think it might be this fella, but I can't work out who it is. Or it may be the midshipman, Mr. Calamy, but again, I'm not sure. I'm basing my guess mostly off the shape of the top hat. If you look, Mr. Calamy wears a more square-topped hat, whereas some of the other midshipmen, such as Mr. Holland, wear one which tapers towards the top. If you look at the deck plan, then the rooms he may have been coming from are the steward's store or captain's store, which would make sense if he was the captain's steward. The officer's stores, which might make sense if it was the midshipman, or the slop room. The slop room is where the clothing and small stores are kept and issued from. Or he may just be doing a walk round and checking on the ship in general. Location-wise, I'm fairly certain he's to the aft end of the ship. As you can see, there's the raised section here and the short steps down to the lower part of the hold, which lines up with the deck plan. He's then heading up the aft ladders onto the berth deck. So he pops out here on the berth deck and makes his way between people sleeping in hammocks. Hammocks were used at sea because it meant there didn't have to be fixed beds. Space was pretty limited, so hammocks were a good way of having removable, full-size sleeping arrangements for the crew. This meant the berth deck wasn't taken up by bed space when it didn't need to be. The routine would be that before you went to bed, you'd hang up your hammock, and then when you started your next shift, you'd lash it up and take it down. Ideally, you would then store it outside on the top deck or weather deck. It would be rolled up tightly and stashed in the netting alongside the gunwales. This allowed for a couple of things. First, it allowed the hammock to air out, and if there was good weather, to be able to dry out a little. Everything below decks would get wet, and at times sailors would be living in permanently wet clothes. Water would leak in from the upper decks from seawater spray washing over the ship, and in really bad weather, even the galley stove couldn't be lit, so there'd be no means for the crew to dry anything. Secondly, it was thought to provide a bit of protection during sea battles. Lining the ship with rolled up hammocks was the naval equivalent of using sandbags to protect the crew from musket fire and splinters. Having all the hammocks stashed down the inside walls of the ship helped dampen the effects of enemy fire. Interestingly enough, using the hammocks as ballistic protection meant that if you made it through an engagement at sea, you might not have a bed to lie down in afterwards. Some sailors recorded this experience in letters home and logbooks. One captain wrote that almost all the hammocks were cut to pieces. Another captain, Captain Donaldson, wrote in his logbook that the gangway netting and hammocks were completely shot to pieces. A midshipman explained his personal quandary to his mother on the 22nd of November, 1805. My hammock and bedding had likewise been shot away in the action, which is the more unfortunate as I can so ill afford to replace them. In 1804, Commodore MacDonough observed that after a battle, There were not 20 whole hammocks in the netting at the close of the action. Just for reference, I didn't gather these quotes. Mini tangent, I really like hammocks, and then I found Michelle Panico's master's thesis, Hammocks, a Maritime Tool, and I realised that I'm just an amateur enthusiast. I don't tend to recommend people's master's theses very often, but I think this one's a pretty interesting read. Also, using hammocks meant that there was less woodwork on the berth deck. All hammocks needed were canvas and lashings. 3-strand white hemp about 15mm diameter if you wanted to be super specific. That's 5/8 of an inch in freedom units. Having less woodwork meant there was less stuff to be turned into shrapnel and splinters in battle. This was the same for partitions for the small cabins along the sides of the ship, which were originally made from wood, but after 1757 were made of canvas as per the Admiralty's orders. This was so they could be triced up during the day and when clearing for action. From what I can tell, the US Navy still use all hands hoist out and trice up as reveille, meaning show a leg and get up out of bed. You can also see the grating here, which leads onto the weather deck, so above this it's open to the elements, which is why no one has hung their hammock underneath it. The Royal Navy, being the Royal Navy, also went to great lengths to stipulate exactly how and where your hammock was going to be slung, with regulations such as hammocks will be secured with 2 half hitches. Divisions were usually kept together. For example, the 4 topmen's hammocks were to the front of the ship, the waisters were amidships, and the marines were to the rear. Because they were taken down daily, hammocks were also marked. To avoid the confusion generally incidental in removing and replacing hammocks, it is recommended to mark them with figures in circles, that the men's different divisions may be instantly discernible. The Admiralty stipulated a colour code for hammock markings. I won't go into full details, but as a few quick examples, main topmen hammocks were blue circles with white numbers, carpenters' crews were white circles with red numbers, gunners' crew were blue circles with red numbers, and the marines red circles with white numbers. On board Royal Navy ships, sailors were allotted a 14-inch wide space for their hammock. US sailors got a bit more room, with 18 inches per man. So a British ship would have far more crew on board than a US ship of the same size, if both were at full complement. I believe they did used to alternate the crew who were sleeping and those who were on watch, so every other hammock would be empty. This way, if you were asleep, the hammock spaces either side of you would be empty, because those sailors would be on watch. If you alternated the crew sleeping and on watch in this way, it meant your allotted 14 inches would be doubled to 28. Also, sailors were not permitted to sleep in the daytime. Hammocks could only be hung between the hours of 8 p.m. and 8 a.m, so sailors could only sleep during the periods of first, middle and morning watch. Unless they were on watch, in which case they'd probably be flogged for sleeping. The sleep schedule for a sailor was also pretty brutal. Unless you were an officer or one of the crew known as idlers, sailors would only be able to sleep for periods of 4 hours maximum, with an allotted 7 hours per 24 hours for sleep. This was split into a 4-hour and a 3-hour block. Idlers and some of the officers could sleep the whole night and would work the daytime hours. There's a bit of a graph showing how this worked out. Having worked 6s when I used to work at sea, that's 6 hours working, 6 hours sleeping and downtime, I can tell you that I don't envy their watch schedule one bit. We then get a shot of a pair of boots and a top hat. My guess is that these belong to a midshipman based on the fact that the shoes are buckled, and it's the same hat we see the midshipman wearing later. Buckles on shoes were worn by the more senior ranks, or those with better social standing, who would want to distinguish themselves from the rest of the rank and file crew. A pair of buckle shoes would be a way of showing you are of high enough status and rich enough to afford a more quality pair of shoes. Midshipmen would also have different hats, depending on if they are in a state of dress or undress. Dress state would be for more formal affairs. Undress state wouldn't be undressed, it would be the day-to-day working rig they'd wear. For midshipmen, a dress state hat would be a bicorn. Undress would be a round hat. I think at this time the undress state hat worn would very much depend on the captain's preference, as some would prefer the fore and aft hat. The round hat was also more squat than the top hat style shown here. I can't quite work out the route the guy is taking here through the ship. I think he's come up from the orlop, comes out here, walked through the berth deck and then goes up the ladders here, because in the next shot we are shown the manger. These pictures are super useful too, so thank you Bruce Trink. I'm sure that's not how you're supposed to pronounce your name. They're super interesting. So he climbs up to the upper deck. This is the last covered deck on the ship and is essentially the fighting deck, where all the majority of the cannons are. The manger, where the animals will be kept, is toward the fore end. That's the pointy end, here. I'm working on the assumption he's going to the quarter galley, or he's got some flavour of admin prep task to do for the captain or the officers before the next watch starts. I think he's come from the captain's or officer's stores in the orlop. And he's gone up, across, up, and now he's walking along the starboard side, back towards the aft end. That's the right side and towards the arse end. I'm guessing he's starboard, not port, or larboard as it would be at this point in time, because we were shown the guns pointing this way. You can see the gunners have named their guns. I can't find anything on if this was a practice in the Royal Navy, or if it was a common thing to do. It wouldn't surprise me, as we still do this today. If you've seen Full Metal Jacket, you'll know the give your rifle a name scene. There are lots of records with guns with nicknames. I just couldn't find any specific for Royal Navy cannons. So if anyone can find one or has an example, I'd love to hear about it. Whilst looking this up, I also came across an interesting argument for encouraging this sort of thing. The theory is that gunners naming their guns, or soldiers their rifles, has a positive war-fighting psychological effect. Because you've named it, you form a bond with it, and are more likely to maintain and look after it. Which, considering it's the thing keeping you alive, seems like it'd be a reasonable thing to encourage. You can see a Royal Marine on watch here too, keeping an eye on things. And I believe this is the door to the captain's bed place, which the Royal Marine is standing guard at. I do find it cool that you can trace these guys all the way back to these guys. He turns right here, so I'm assuming he's going to this door, not parading through the captain's cabin. The next shot is the hourglass, and you can see here he taps it to get the last of the sand out, double check to make sure that when he turns it over again, it's got the full globe of sand, that it hasn't clogged or anything. Then the ship bell is rung 8 times, and we come on to the very confusing topic of the watch system. I might do a video on this at some point, unless I can find someone who's done a better one, in which case I'm not going to bother, because it gives me a headache. Ship's crews will be divided into 2 divisions, starboard and port watch. Again, port, which is left, would have been larboard at this point in time, so it's a starboard and a larboard watch. Ship jobs could be considered as those that needed to be done 24 hours of the day, so someone would always have to be up and awake to man that task, and those that could be done in daytime. Think of that more as the 9 to 5 working day. I'm going to ignore the non-watch style positions for now. A 24-hour period would be divided into 6 watches. Normally, a dogged watch system was used, so the 6th watch would be split into 2 separate watches, half the length of a normal watch. These shorter watches were called dog watches. A watch would last 4 hours, a dog watch would last 2. Having the dog watch meant the crew wouldn't be stuck on the same watch pattern every day. It would alternate because you've got an odd number of watches. So if you started your day on the morning watch at 4, you'd work 4 till 8, rest 8 till 12, then work 12 till 4, then have 2 hours rest and start again on the second dog watch. The day after, you wouldn't be working the 4-8 watch again. That'd be your downtime, and your watch and rest periods would alternate. The ship's bell would be rung every 30 minutes in patterns from 1 bell to 8 bells for every watch. A watch is 4 hours, so the first half hour would be 1 bell. The hour would be 2 bells, and so on until the full 4 hours, which is signalled by 8 bells. 8 bells would be the end of the watch. The bell would be rung in patterns of 2, so each pair of bell strikes would signal 1 hour. In the scene, the bell is rung 8 times, 4 sets of 2 strikes, signalling 8 o'clock. This is the start of the forenoon watch, which ran from 8 till 12. The next shot is of the top men coming down from the rigging and others going up. The top men were the ones who manned the ship's mast and sails working aloft, and they would be the more experienced seafarers. They're showing the changing of the shift, so some are coming down and off watch and the others are going up to start theirs. The next shot shows the ship with most of her sails reefed up. She's just sailing with a fore topsail and main topsail set and the stays. I think this is more of a patrol speed or slow speed sort of setup. I think it is similar to easy sail or fighting sail. Fella getting eggs for breakfast. He's the captain's steward, preserved Killick. I guess he wasn't coming up from the hold because he's half dressed here, although in the books he did steal from the captain's stores. Pippin steering the ship here. Again, you'd think that actually steering the ship would be solely down to the captain, but it wasn't. It was the coxswain's job. The difficult bit wasn't steering the thing, well, unless you count the manual effort involved in actually steering the thing. The difficult bit would be planning the route, knowing what to do with the sails, and plotting the course. You can see there are two ships' wheels, or a dual wheel sort of arrangement. They didn't have power steering or anything. It was a physical connection between the helmsman and the rudder, using ropes and pulleys. Having two wheels meant you could get more than one person around the wheel to help turn if needed. Double up on the manpower. Midshipman asleep here. I'm guessing it's the start of his watch, and not that he'd fallen asleep on watch. Falling asleep on watch was a pretty serious offence, particularly if you were a midshipman. Midshipman position was essentially for an officer under instruction, so even though they might be a young boy, they would outrank a lot of the crew, as they were considered as officers and gentlemen. Following examination, a midshipman would go on to become a lieutenant. There's a man aloft reefing the sails. He's either reefing the sails or checking the knots are still secure and tightening loose lashings. You can see here he's barefoot. A lot of sailors would work barefoot because you could get better traction or wouldn't be as likely to slip. Rubber shoes weren't a thing at this point in time, so shoe soles would be leather, which would be incredibly slippy on a wet deck. There's accounts of people working both barefoot and with shoes. There are accounts that after standing around in water on the deck, the skin on sailors' feet would go soft, and once you went aloft, the ropes would chew them up. I imagine shoes, no shoes was very much at the captain's discretion and down to individuals and the conditions, and if it was wet or dry, or what work they were doing, or if they owned shoes. The man aloft calls out there's something of interest on the starboard bow, and midshipman goes forward. You can see how crowded the deck is. This is one of the best elements of the film. It just shows the actual reality of what life would have been like. These things would have been cramped and stuffy and busy, and there would have been people everywhere. This film does a really good representation of showing how crowded a ship would have been at that time. So they hear a bell, and as they say, they think it could be a merchant vessel or a reef marker, but of course they are in hostile waters. Obviously, you don't want to go crashing into a reef, but they also need to identify the source of it. If it is an enemy ship, they need to be ready. Mr. Holland asks for the lead. What he wants is a sounding with a lead line. This is where you drop a length of rope with a weight on the end, lead in this case, over the side of the ship. Just at the point when you feel the rope isn't holding the weight anymore, it means your weight has hit the seabed, so you reel back in and measure how much rope got paid out. This gives you an idea of how deep the sea is around you. You can see in this shot the midshipman in charge of the sounding and the sailor taking the sounding. I imagine this is something you would not want to mess up. They report back 5 fathoms, which is 30 feet, around 9 metres. He also says sand and broken shell. The lead weight has tallow on the bottom, which would be a sticky gloop made from animal fat. This let whatever was on the seabed stick to the sounding weight. In this case, the seabed composition is sand and broken shell. I'm not super clued up on why you'd want to know the seabed type. I believe knowing you've got sand beneath you is good, because it means you can drop anchor, if needed. I think if you're a touch and go in terms of running aground, being able to know you've got sand underneath, and not rock, would also help decision making, i.e. what level of risk are you taking on by sailing into shallow waters. I also believe seabed compositions were kept in nautical maps, so you could confirm where you were based on the seabed. If you're somewhere where it's charted to have a sandy seabed, and you can't pull up any sand on a sounding, it's a pretty good indicator you're in the wrong place. Mr. Holland then says 2 points off the starboard bow. The points system used 32 equally spaced points around the ship, each one representing 11.25 degrees. The points would be in respect to the bow, the beam, or quarter. I think a picture will do this more justice than I can trying to explain it. Basically what he's saying is it's in front of and slightly to the right of us. Obviously then he panics and doesn't want to commit to a decision. Sailors look to the officer class for direction. It was a rough old life out there, and officers had to be certain of themselves, and the crew had to trust in them to keep them safe. You did not want to be caught looking like you're second-guessing yourself. So, the other midshipman calls beat to quarters, which is the ship going to war-fighting mode, and I think I'll leave it there for this one, and cover that in the next. Hope you found this useful, or interesting at least. Pull me up on anything you think I've got wrong down below, and beat to quarters.